We'll reconvene the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. We'll move along with focus on the chapters related to the Western Development Museum. I want to welcome a couple officials that are with us here today. The Deputy Minister of Parks, Culture and Sport, Ms. McDougall. Thank you so much, Deputy Minister McDougall, for joining us. And thank you as well for the Chief Executive Officer of the Western Development Museum, Ms. Joan Canagan, for joining us here today. And I would invite Ms. McDougall to introduce the other officials with her here today. Then we'll turn it over to the auditor, and then your subsequent response.
Perfect. Thank you, and good afternoon. Because you already know me, so that speeds that up. I'd like to introduce the other officials. Joan Canagan came from Saskatoon today to be with us here, so thank you, Joan, for coming. And I understand right after this she's on vacation leave, so no hurry though. We can keep her as long as we want. And then behind me I have Dan French, the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Stewardship Division with Parks, Culture and Sport, and Pam Herbert is our Executive Director of Strategic and Corporate Services with Parks, Culture and Sport. And we're glad to be here today.
Thanks so much. We're glad to have you here. I will now table as well PAC 7129 Western Development Museum status update dated September 6th, 2022. Thank you so much to the officials that were involved in putting this status update together for us. I'll turn it over to the auditor and her office to present on the chapters before us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Deputy Chair, committee members, and officials. With me today is Mr. Jason Shaw, Deputy Provincial Auditor, and he will be doing the presentations. We will be doing the first two chapters together in one presentation, and there is no new recommendation. They are just a status update on two follow-ups we have done. And the second presentation does have one new recommendation for the committee's consideration. Before I turn it over to Jason, I would like to say thank you to the ministry and the CEO of WDM for the cooperation that was extended to us during the course of our work. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
The Western Development Museum is responsible for collecting, preserving, restoring, and exhibiting objects of historical value and importance to Saskatchewan and their disposal under the Western Development Museum Act. Since its creation in 1949, the museum has collected and displayed artifacts of artistic, cultural, historical, or scientific significance to the province. Permanent removal of artifacts helps maintain the relevance of the collections while managing costs and storage space. In 2016, we audited and found the museum had effective processes to permanently remove historical artifacts from its collections, except for the 8 recommendations made. Since 2016, we have completed 2 audits following up the museum's progress on implementing those 8 recommendations. In Chapter 48 in our 2018 Report Volume 2, starting on page 313, we report the results of the museum's progress made to August 2018. The museum implemented 4 of the 8 original audit recommendations. The museum's board of directors revised its delegation of authority to permit the chief executive officer to approve changes to operational policies. The museum updated curatorial staff job descriptions to clarify expectations for the identification of potential artifacts for deaccessioning and disposal. It used its database to run reports to analyze its collection to help decide which types of items to consider further for deaccessioning. Lastly, the museum appropriately approved the artifacts recommended for disposal of artifacts that were no longer significant to the museum's collection. In Chapter 45, in our 2020 Report Volume 2, starting on page 309, reports the results of the progress made on the 4 remaining recommendations in our second follow-up audit. By March 2020, the museum had implemented 3 of the 4 outstanding recommendations. The museum appropriately updated its operational collection management policies for disposing of collection items. For example, this updated policy provided staff with clear written guidance for when to obtain independent appraisals of artifacts identified for disposal. For the sample of 30 artifacts removed from its collection that we tested, we found the museum followed its processes in the updated policy as expected. Also, we found the museum board received, at least quarterly, adequate information about the deaccessioning of artifacts to enable it to monitor deaccessioning activities. For example, the information included the types of artifacts and the reasons for removal from the collection. As of March 2020, the museum was still working to develop its collections development plan to guide staff in the systematic review of planned deaccession projects. For example, a project may include reviewing its entire card collection overall to determine if and which items should be removed from the collection. An unsystematic review process could lead to keeping duplicate or deteriorated artifacts in its collection and potentially increase storage costs of housing those artifacts that should be disposed of. This concludes my presentation, and I will pause for the committee's consideration. Thank you.
Thank you for the focus of the work, the presentation. I'll turn it over to Ms. McDougall.
Yes, thank you. The WDM, or Western Development Museum, is under the authority of the Western Development Museum Act and is a corporate body with exhibit branches at North Battleford, Saskatoon, Moose Jaw, and Yorkton. And in 2016, the provincial auditor identified and made 8 recommendations to the Western Development Museum through the audit and its internal processes. 4 of the 8 recommendations from the provincial auditor's report have been addressed and implemented by the WDM, and today I'm happy to report the 4 outstanding recommendations from chapters 17, 45, and 48 of the report have been successfully addressed and implemented by the WDM. We're open to any questions you may have.
Thank you so very much, and I'll open it up for questions. Ms. Young?
Thank you very much. I have a question on the collections development plan, which is cited throughout some of the now implemented recommendations. And understanding, I hope that this plan was put in place, and I think it was November 2020. Now being not quite halfway through the implementation of this plan, providing a framework for the care of your collections. How's that going?
We've started working specifically with the car collection and a recommendation to deaccession, and I'll have to come back with you the exact number of 1920 cars that we have deaccessioned. Our collection is over 75,000 objects that range everywhere from pins to locomotives and includes a grain elevator. So it is a slow process to go and assess every single object in our collection. We were actually very fortunate. We've just received funding through the Young Canada Works program to have an intern for a full year who will be working specifically in our furnishing collections to do that systematic review of the items that are in our collection. So it's going to take us a while to go through everything, but all of the objects that are being offered and donated to us are going through that collections process, and we use our database very closely to make sure that we don't have, or we're not bringing in duplicates, and if they are, there's a really, really good reason for why we're doing that.
And the undertaking of that work that you've cited with the diversity and sheer number of objects and artifacts that you have, that review that student will be undertaking, is that across all of your locations, like the full collection?
Actually, it'll just be the part of the collection that's not on display. Most of our collection is housed that isn't on display is housed in our corporate office, which is a separate building located in Saskatoon. So that's where the bulk of the work will be done. Some of the assessments will be done on site in our locations, but right now we're going to be focusing on the corporate office because that's where the bulk of things that aren't worth putting on display are. So we'll have a much bigger bang for the time that we have to focus on the one location at this time.
Okay, interesting. And as the museum undertakes a review of this, obviously I think you've mentioned a couple goals in terms of ensuring there's not a duplication of artifacts, as well as tackling what I imagine is an incredibly interesting storage facility. Are there other secondary goals that are helping to guide this ongoing work? For example, is there a longer-term goal, and forgive me having not read the collections development plan, of downsizing the collection to a certain size, or perhaps, limiting the storage space. I know cost is cited in the initial chapter as one of the risks associated with an out-of-date collections management procedure. Can you talk about some of those secondary goals that are a part of this work?
We don't have a specific number in terms of the objects that we want in our collection, but there are definitely gaps in our collection, particularly post-1940. We have very little in our collection that actually speaks to the post-1940s. We also have very little that speaks to the diversity of our province's, ethnocultural communities. So we're doing very targeted looking at what we want to acquire into our collection to ensure that we're actually representing all of Saskatchewan's diverse communities, with a particular focus on recent immigrants, 1930s and on, and Indigenous communities, because we have very little in our collection with that respect. So we're working very closely with First Nations communities to be able to increase our relevance in that way. The biggest bulk of our storage really is the large automobiles and vehicles, and so that's where we'll actually, once we're starting able to remove those from our collection, and it's a little bit like Tetris where you have to kind of pull one thing out, but to get it, you have to move about 10 other things. So once we start moving some of the vehicles that have been deaccessioned out of the storage facility, that will actually free up a lot of space for more artifacts in our collection that represent things that we're missing.
And what does that outreach process look like as you look to expand and fill some of those self-identified gaps in the collection?
A lot of our outreach right now is very community to community. So for example, we've been working very, very closely with Whitecap Dakota First Nation. We had found photos in our archives that we didn't know who the people were in the images from Pioneer in the 1950s. And so we went out to the elders and we met with them and developed this wonderful partnership. And we will be opening an exhibit on October the 11th that was built in partnership with Whitecap Dakota First Nation. And then in North Battleford, we've been working very closely with Kanawamic Child Services. And for the past 2 years, they've set up a teepee village in the North Battleford Village and have offered teepee teachings to all of our guests and visitors as part of their outreach. So a lot of our work is very much community to community and just seeing how we can serve and how we can help create more representation within our facility.
Fascinating, thank you. So kind of ongoing community development work as well. It's interesting. I have no further questions.
Any further questions from committee members? Deputy Chair Hargrave, and then over to Nerleen after that.
Just a quick one on some of the items that, you said some of the larger items that are coming out now, you're selling through auction or through, do you expect to get like a fairly reasonable, that's going to help you do other things? Like, is going to make some money there so you can spend more?
There's actually a very strict process for museums around deaccessioning and the sale of artifacts. The ideal is to keep everything in the public domain, so we do offer to other museums first, particularly in Saskatchewan. If nobody accepts them, then they do go to auction, and any money we receive from that process will then go back into improving the care of our existing collection.
Mr. Nerleen.
Thank you. How do you identify or segregate what might be uniquely Saskatchewan artifacts? And understand, elevators are largely Western Canadian. Vehicles aren't. Vehicles can be anywhere. So how do you identify and segregate uniquely Saskatchewan?
It's actually a lot of research on the part of our very talented collections team. We look at the history of ownership, the stories that are surrounding those particular objects. And as part of our assessment process, we're actually assessing based on significance, historical, cultural, and so it's really the stories that we collect when something comes into our care. We do a lot of interviews with the donors so that we know what that significance is. But you're correct. There's also a lot of things that are just in the collection, because museums would, and this is just the nature of all museums, would just collect everything and anything. And so part of our deaccessioning process is to do the research to find out if there is anything uniquely Saskatchewan about a particular object before we determine whether it stays in the collection or not.
With respect to chapters 48 and 45, I not seeing any further questions. I would welcome a motion to conclude consideration. Mr. Harrison moves. All agreed? That's carried. We'll turn our attention to chapter 17.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chapter 17 of our 2020 report, Volume 2, starting on page 101, reports the annual integrated audit of Western Development Museum for the year ended March 31st, 2020. The museum had effective rules and procedures to safeguard public resources, other than the need to follow its policy for the use of purchase orders. The museum's 2019-2020 financial statements were reliable, and it complied with authorities governing its activities. We made one new recommendation. On page 103, we recommended the museum consistently document the approval of purchase orders before it purchases goods or services. During our audit, we identified 7 purchases where the purchase order did not show that the appropriate authorization occurred prior to making the purchase. Approving purchase orders before making a purchase decreases the risk of staff making inappropriate or unauthorized purchases. Having clear documentation of such prior approval enables monitoring and demonstration of staff compliance with good purchasing practices and the museum's policy. Then in Chapter 14 of our 2021 report, Volume 2, on page 81, reports that during the year ended March 31st, 2021, management did improve its purchase order policy and also reviewed each purchase order during the year to verify purchase orders were properly approved. During our testing, we did not identify any purchases in our sample where the employee made a purchase before obtaining an approved purchase order. Therefore, we consider this recommendation implemented. This concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. I'll turn it over to Ms. McDougall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I have nothing further to add apart from my opening statements. So we're open for questions.
Open it up for the questions. Deputy Chair Hargrave.
Thank you. I see on your statement of revenues and expenses that, you know, you had a loss in 1920 of 611 and another loss of 365. Is that consistent, or is that like, is there a plan to sort of not lose money?
When we're looking at the combined statements, we actually break our statements into our operational funds, which we try very hard not to have any losses in, and we did not last year or the year before. I'd have to double check. I can't say for sure, but the year before that. We also have fund accounts, and these fund accounts are monies that we receive over the years that we set aside, and basically like a savings account for major projects that we can't complete in a normal fiscal year. So for example, this past year we had to replace 2 boilers at the WDM Saskatoon for about $260,000, and we're replacing a section of the roof at our corporate office for $800,000. And those are funds that come out of our capital savings. Because of the way generally accepted accounting principles work, the money that we receive is recorded in the year that it's received, but the money that is spent is recorded in the year that it's spent. So those funds always show a deficit, which kind of balances out that way in our books. But we focus very hard on having no operational deficit from year to year.
Mr. Gowdy.
Sorry, just on the same chart there, your expenses, what's the support programs and services? What is that compared to the curatorial programs and visitor services? What's support services?
That would be our administration, and it's the way they're classified in our audit. So it's our administration, it's our marketing, fundraising, curatorial service. Well, curatorial is separate, so it would be the additional programming, a lot of our program activities as well.
Question for the auditor on the 7 purchases identified where the purchase order didn't show the appropriate authorization had occurred. Were there any concerns with the purchases themselves or just the process?
I believe it's just the process.
Yeah, it was just the process in that you should really make sure that you've got that authorization before, but in terms of what was purchased, was that approved in terms of the payment? that was fine. It's just a matter of almost like committing to something you shouldn't without those approvals before purchases are made, but there wasn't any questionable purchases made.
Any further questions? Not seeing any. Thank you again for the work on this front. This is a new recommendation that's before us, so I would welcome a motion to concur with the recommendation and note compliance. Moved by Deputy Chair Hargrave. All agreed? Okay, that's carried. I'd simply like to say thank you so very much to those officials that are here with us today, all those that are involved in this very important work. And yeah, thanks for the time, the answers, and implementing those recommendations. Would either Ms. Canagan or Ms. McDougall have any parting words you'd like to offer us?
I would just like to say a few words. I'd really like to thank the Provincial Auditor's Office for their diligence and recommendations, and then for the opportunity to speak to those recommendations here today. So thank you very much for that. It's always helpful.
Well, thank you so very much. Okay, have a wonderful day. We'll have a very brief recess, and then we'll get at it with the Ministry of Government Relations.